Right, so the Lebanon ceasefire with Israel, a ceasefire in name only, as has been the case for almost a year now. But look at southern Lebanon or the Bekaa and you'll see what's actually happening. Israeli drones and jets have been back in the air, hitting asphalt plants, quarries, fuel tankers, private cars, even shattering school windows. Maurice Tidball-Binz, the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, has already stated that unless Israel can prove those civilian objects had military use, these killings violate the right to life and may amount to war crimes. Yet more of them. Israel has not presented that proof. And while the strikes continue, a US envoy has stepped forward to explain the political terms. Disarm Hezbollah or expect more of the same. So that's the offer then, is it? Give up the only deterrent to invasion or watch the infrastructure of daily life ground into dust again. And they assume Lebanon won't recognise the pattern. Right, so the break became visible when a United Nations Special Rapporteur stated in an on-the-record written communication that Israeli strikes on civilian vehicles in Lebanon could constitute war crimes. Maurice Tidball-Binz, the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, stated that unless Israel could prove military necessity, the strikes violated the right to life and may constitute war crimes. And the reasoning behind that was plain. Civilian objects are protected under international humanitarian law unless the attacking state can demonstrate a concrete military purpose. In the incidents under discussion, no such justification had been publicly presented, and I doubt any ever will, because this is Israel we are talking about. The rapporteur's judgment was that the killings violated the right to life and the principles of precaution and proportionality, but the language was specific, it was legal, it was direct. And once that statement was issued, the frame shifted. These were no longer border exchanges or security incidents. They were unlawful killings during a period in which a ceasefire was formally in place. In the days around that statement, the strikes intensified. Israeli drones and warplanes hit targets across South Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley. They struck an asphalt factory near Ansar and Sanay. They struck a quarry near the same area. They hit a diesel tanker. They struck a civilian car on a road in the Nabatea district, killing and injuring people whose identities were confirmed by Lebanon's Ministry of Health. They struck the outskirts of Shmemstar, where the shock from the explosions shattered the windows of a school and injured children inside classrooms. These events were recorded by field reporters, by Lebanon's state news agency and by local authorities. None of these details rely on rumour or anonymous sources or claims from unknown actors. What links all these targets isn't even military infrastructure. It is the material basis of daily life. The asphalt plant produces the road surface needed for transportation. The quarry supplies building materials. The diesel tanker feeds generators and farm machinery in a country where the electrical grid is, well, unreliable, let's put it, especially in the south of the country. The civilian vehicles and agricultural transport allow people to work and to move and to deliver goods and keep rural communities functioning. The school provides continuity in education and the basic structure of ordinary life. Lebanon is not in a position of economic surplus, nothing like it. The country has endured a near total banking collapse, a currency that has lost most of its value, and fuel shortages that have forced businesses and households to ration electricity, heating and transportation. Under these conditions, the destruction of machinery and infrastructure does not just delay repairs, it deepens the crisis. An excavator destroyed in a wealthy economy just gets replaced, doesn't it? An excavator destroyed in Lebanon remains a cratered shell, because the capital to replace it simply doesn't exist. A quarry damaged under stable economic conditions resumes production very quickly. A quarry damaged in Lebanon now remains idle, and construction slows or stops completely. The cost is not isolated to the hit site, it reverberates through supply chains and labour markets and household budgets. A strike on a beekeeping truck in southern Lebanon, reported by local media, is a pretty good example, actually. Beekeeping is part of the agricultural economy in the south of Lebanon. Honey production is an important source of income there. Bees also pollinate orchards and crops. So destroying hives disrupts ecological regeneration and food systems. A hit like that's not incidental, it targets the continuity of rural life. Now, this is where the stated justification and the observed outcomes diverge. Israel says it targets Hezbollah infrastructure embedded in civilian areas. Lebanon residents and multiple independent correspondents say the hits are striking civilian infrastructure and livelihoods. Under law, the state conducting the strike must demonstrate that the civilian object served a concrete military role. That demonstration has not been made publicly, so the burden remains unmet and will likely remain so too. The strikes took place under a ceasefire that was supposed to prevent exactly this type of escalation, and that makes the legal question sharper, not softer. Lebanon's ceasefire with Israel being what it is, as we know it to be. But at the same time that the strikes intensified, a diplomatic message was also delivered. The US envoy Tom Barrack stated that unless Lebanon disarms Hezbollah, a major confrontation with Israel could follow. Well, Israel has been abusing that ceasefire for nearly a year, as I alluded to just then. Lebanon ceased, they're still firing. That is what Israel sees as a ceasefire, is it not? And yet Barrack threatens worse than criticising the breaches of Israel is already guilty of. Thousands of them. There's words for someone like Barrack, but YouTube would have a fit if I said any of them. He described a disarmament framework supervised by the United States and France, with economic incentives attached. He said Lebanon rejected it due to Hezbollah's influence in government. The message was framed as negotiation, therefore. The structure of the message was instead coercion. It presented Lebanon's internal security arrangements as subject to external approval. It linked Lebanon's political sovereignty to the threat of war. The military pressure and the diplomatic pressure are not separate events, they're coordinated instruments. The airstrikes degrade the infrastructure of daily life. The diplomatic statements apply political leverage. Together they attempt to force Lebanon into a position where disarmament appears to be the only way to prevent further destruction. The underlying assumption is that economic strain will translate into political pressure from the population against the resistance. But the areas under attack are the same regions that have lived under occupation and under bombardment and evacuation and reconstruction before. The people who live there have seen this strategy applied over decades. They do not interpret the strikes as neutral security measures, they interpret them as attempts to force their submission, and the political response has reflected that understanding. Lebanon's Speaker of Parliament, Nabih Berri, publicly confirmed that negotiations proposing a cessation of hostilities and border demarcation had collapsed, and that Lebanon would adhere to the mechanisms of the supposed ceasefire instead. He emphasised that national unity between government, army and resistance is essential. That was not rhetorical positioning, it was a strategic response to a coercive threat. When a country is pressured to restructure its internal security under threat of force, unity becomes a defensive posture in and of itself. The campaign is built on the assumption that pressure will create division. The reality observed so far is that pressure is creating cohesion instead. The strikes targeting the infrastructure of life do not isolate the resistance. They reinforce the belief that resistance is necessary. Each strike confirms the premise that sovereignty cannot be protected by concession, and people don't believe in the state army as they do in that resistance. There's also the matter of documentation. The UN Rapporteur's statement was the beginning, not the end, of the legal record. Lebanese authorities recorded casualties and damage. Journalists documented impact sites. Field reports from the affected regions have consistent detail. These records will form the basis of legal and diplomatic arguments. Israel has faced such scrutiny before in Gaza and the West Bank. It knows the implications. The difference in Lebanon, and as is the case right now in Gaza as well, is that these strikes are happening under a ceasefire, alleged. That increases the weight of the legal assessment nonetheless, though. European diplomatic sources have said that a large Israeli operation may be a matter of time. And this is a signal that escalation is already underway, isn't it? It's not like Israel ever took the ceasefire seriously, much as seems to be the case in Gaza as well. And indeed, people there have said they fear a Lebanon-style ceasefire in Gaza because it fundamentally isn't one in practice. It is also a signal that the political actors observing this escalation recognise the risks but are unable or unwilling to apply restraint. The language carries concern, not confidence. The United States continues to position itself as both mediator and enforcer. It supplies the diplomatic cover that shields Israel from consequences while warning Lebanon of the price of refusal. And this dual role is not contradictory by accident. It is a mechanism of control. Again, instability creates leverage. Leverage is used to impose desired political outcomes. Stability would remove that leverage. So Lebanon is operating under severe economic and social strain on purpose. Striking the infrastructure that allows life to continue under such conditions isn't incidental either. That is strategic. The cost of each strike is multiplied by the fragility already in place. But fragility does not necessarily produce surrender. It can produce determination too. The memory of occupation, of bombardment and reconstruction is long in Lebanon. These communities do not respond to external pressure by abandoning their land. They tighten their social ties instead. The campaign was built on the belief that Lebanon would break. As far as its leadership goes, that might not be a mislaid belief. But the evidence is also there, especially amongst ordinary Lebanese people, showing the opposite. The situation is not stable, it's not resolved, it's still in flux. What happens next depends on whether the policy architects recognise that the strategy they designed is no longer achieving the outcomes they intended. To understand why the strikes have not produced the political effect they wanted, the economic and social context in Lebanon is setting out quite clearly. Lebanon is not entering this moment from a position of normalcy at all. The country has experienced one of the most severe financial collapses anywhere in the world of the 21st century. The banking sector has completely imploded. Depositors lost access to their savings. The national currency lost the majority of its value. The state's electricity system has disintegrated to the point where most households now rely on private generators powered by diesel fuel. Municipalities struggle to maintain even basic services. Many villages in the South and Bekaa Valley have been sustaining themselves through local networks, remittances, and community-level resource pooling. In such conditions, infrastructure like asphalt plants and quarries are not simply industrial sites. They're the backbone of the ability to just fix the roads, just maintain agriculture, just to rebuild the homes and keep trade routes functioning. When those are destroyed, the cost is not temporary interruption, it's a far deeper economic paralysis. A destroyed asphalt plant means roads cannot be resurfaced. If roads degrade, transport slows. If transport slows, farmers cannot reach markets, workers cannot travel, basic goods become more expensive. A destroyed quarry means construction materials become scarce or expensive. That in turn slows the rebuilding of homes damaged in previous shelling and storms. It also slows new housing projects and agricultural infrastructure. These costs fall not on the state treasury, though. That's already been hollowed out by national economic crisis, but directly on families and municipalities. The diesel tanker strike must also be understood in this context, therefore. Diesel is not a luxury fuel in Lebanon. It's the basis for electricity generation in homes and in hospitals and bakeries and farms and schools. Destroying diesel reserves during fuel scarcity is a direct hit on a country's ability to keep its most basic systems running. It raises household electricity costs. It disrupts refrigeration of food. It undermines hospital equipment. You can begin to see the parallels with Gaza now, can't you? It sets back agricultural production that depends on irrigation pumps. None of these effects need to be stated obviously in print or on the news. They are straightforward material consequences. Israel hasn't had to level Lebanon as it has done in Gaza to produce similar effects. When the United States envoy says Lebanon has been offered economic incentives in exchange for disarmament, this is the economic terrain on which that offer lands. The message is, give up the armed force that deters external attack, and in exchange, the economic crisis might ease. This is not a negotiation conducted between equals, it's a negotiation structured through deprivation. The economic leverage would not exist without the collapse of the banking system and the fragility of state infrastructure. When the same actors who express concern over Lebanon's economic state also back the military strikes deepening that economic harm, it's clear the crisis is being treated not as a humanitarian problem, but as a pressure instrument. The political system in Lebanon has a lot of flaws. No one living in the country is unaware of that. But the current configuration in which the National Army, the resistance and the government coordinate on border defence is not an accident. It's the result of prior invasions, occupations and confrontations. It exists because no single institution in Lebanon has ever been able to unilaterally protect the border against a militarily superior adversary. This is not a point of ideology, it's a point of recorded history. When the US envoy calls for disarmament supervised by foreign powers, he's not proposing a security reform. He's proposing the removal of Lebanon's deterrent capability under conditions of ongoing threat. The strikes on civilian and economic infrastructure are what make that proposal appear urgent. The message being delivered is that the cost of maintaining resistance is Lebanon's destruction, and the cost of surrender would be their relief. But the communities under attack are the same communities that lived through the years when there was no deterrent force at all. They remember what happened then. They remember what happened when Israel invaded before, and they didn't have that. Those are lived memories. This is why the recent strikes are not generating the political pressure the United States and Israel expected. Economic pain is real. Social strain is real. But they're not being interpreted as a result of internal political choices. They're being interpreted as a result of external coercion. And when people experience coercion, they do not demand that their defenders step down. They demand that they remain in place. The Lebanese Parliament Speaker's statements reflect that reality. He did not frame the situation as a clash of visions within Lebanon. He framed it as a confrontation imposed from outside. He linked adherence to the ceasefire mechanism directly to national sovereignty. And he made clear that negotiations had collapsed because Israel rejected proposals that would have set the groundwork for de-escalation. Inside Lebanon, political actors who disagree on a wide range of economic and social policy questions are aligning around a single point: the right of Lebanon to define its own security arrangements. We hear Israel talk of national security all the time, but what of Lebanon's right to that here? It's non-existent. This is not ideological alignment, it's defensive alignment. It's the recognition that when external actors seek to determine the composition of a state's internal security forces, The state's no longer sovereign. And I've spoken about sovereignty a number of times in recent videos now. There's a common theme around the world right now with it, from Lebanon to Palestine to Venezuela and Colombia, where sovereignty is being undermined for a desired outcome. So in this environment, every strike on infrastructure confirms the perception that the pressure is aimed not at armed combatants, but at the society that sustains them. Every destroyed workshop, road, or agricultural vehicle is read as evidence that the objective is to make life untenable. And because of that reading, the strikes do not separate the population from the resistance. They solidify the connection between them instead. The United States is aware of these dynamics. It publicly warns of the danger of escalation while continuing to provide the diplomatic cover that enables the strikes. The dual message is deliberate. It's intended to pressure Lebanon into making internal changes to avoid further harm, but the logic is breaking down. The social networks that sustain communities in the south, family ties and remittances and cooperative farming or religious institutions or social solidarity, they've all been built up through decades of hardship. They do not collapse when material conditions worsen, they intensify, which brings us to the Israeli strategic assumption. The campaign presumes that Lebanon is brittle, that economic strain will cause social fracture, that social fracture will lead to political realignment, that political realignment will isolate the resistance. That isolation will make disarmament feasible. The evidence available does not support this chain of causation at all. The result is the reverse. Pressure is producing cohesion, but cohesion is not stability in and of itself. It's endurance. And endurance under bombardment carries a cost. And that cost is borne by households and workers and farmers and municipal administrators and families rebuilding lives repeatedly interrupted by conflict. The cost is not invisible. It's understood at every level of Lebanese society, but it does not translate into political surrender. It translates into persistence instead. The campaign's second assumption that disarmament under pressure will produce regional stability is also failing. A large-scale military operation against Lebanon, acknowledged as a possibility by European diplomatic sources, would not produce quiet. It would risk opening multiple fronts and drawing in regional actors. The idea that Lebanon will disarm to avoid that outcome misunderstands the basic premise of deterrence. Deterrence exists because threat exists. Remove deterrence and the threat increases. If this comes to pass, Hezbollah, having sat on their arms, will almost certainly pick them up again and be seen widely in Lebanon to be justified in doing so. And what of the UN peacekeeper force UNIFIL in which case? Will this not be another direct threat against them and an undermining of UN Resolution 1701, seemingly supported by the US all the way? The situation is therefore caught between escalation and recognition of failure. To escalate risks a broader conflict. To recognise failure requires a shift in strategic thinking that has not occurred. The result is continuation of a campaign that is not achieving its stated goals and is deepening the conditions that will sustain its opposition. To understand where this leads, we have to widen the frame beyond the border itself. Lebanon is not being pressured in isolation. The same logic, destroy the basis of daily life, condition reconstruction on political compliance, define sovereignty as negotiable, has been applied in Gaza, in parts of the West Bank, and in previous phases of Lebanon's own modern history. The difference now is that the strategy is unfolding in a context where the population targeted already sees it coming. They already recognise the structure. Nothing about the current campaign is unfamiliar to them. They've seen what follows disarmament under duress, and what have lived through and what happens when the capacity to deter invasion is removed. This is why the strikes carry a strategic cost for Israel that is still accumulating. The campaign does not appear to be disrupting the resistance's command structure. It is not producing internal political rupture. It is not creating a crisis of legitimacy for the resistance. Instead, it is reinforcing the perception that the resistance is necessary to prevent territorial loss and forced displacement. This is especially significant given that Lebanese political actors have explicitly stated that Israel's objective in previous escalations included attempts to reoccupy territory south of the Litani River. When political leaders say that these plans were thwarted through armed deterrence, they're not speaking in rhetorical terms, they're referencing what they regard as documented military intent. The strikes, therefore, do not simply harm, they clarify. They show the population who is attempting to determine the conditions of their life, movement, rebuilding and security. And because those actions are understood as external impositions, the internal political space does not fracture, it closes ranks. And this has direct consequences for the 2026 parliamentary elections in Lebanon. Lebanon's electoral system is structured around confessional representation, local power bases and regional loyalties. The areas now being bombarded are also areas that contribute significantly to the electoral strength of parties aligned with resistance. The strikes do not weaken that strength, they intensify it. A population under attack does not shift away from the actors defending it, it becomes more committed to them. If the campaign was intended to reshape the electoral landscape, it is shaping it in the opposite direction. Tom Barrack's statement that failure to disarm Hezbollah could delay the 2026 elections was notable. It signalled a willingness to link electoral sovereignty directly to compliance with external security demands. It also suggested that political timelines inside Lebanon are being treated as variables subject to strategic pressure. But elections held under threat are not experienced as exercises in civic participation. They're experienced as referenda on sovereignty itself. So again, we circle back to that point. The more direct the threat, the less room there is for internal political realignment to occur peacefully. So in this sense, the pressure campaign is not only ineffective, it is destabilising the very conditions under which electoral legitimacy can even exist. The legal dimension is also developing here. The UN Rapporteur's statement was a formal entry point. Documentation is ongoing. Lebanese ministries, civil society networks, international legal monitors are all recording dates and coordinates and damage patterns and casualty details. The strikes took place under a ceasefire, which means they're not interpreted through the same legal framework as open war. The threshold for illegality is a lot lower, and the evidentiary burden is a lot easier to meet. And the significance of this is not immediate. International accountability, as we know, is bloody slow. But it is cumulative. It does get there. The record will be established. And the record being established now will shape diplomatic relations, arms sale debates, and international legal filings going forwards into the future. Israel's long-term strategic position depends heavily on diplomatic support from the US and Europe. It depends on the ability of its allies to defend its actions in international forums and to block or weaken resolutions that challenge its conduct. If the pattern of strikes in Lebanon continues, and if the documentation remains as clear as it currently is, the cost of maintaining that diplomatic cover will inevitably rise. States with domestic constituencies sensitive to international law will find it harder to justify. And as the gap between official rhetoric and documented action widens, the credibility of the justifying narratives erode. Meanwhile, the campaign is also producing consequences beyond Lebanon's borders. Other regional actors are observing the situation closely. The assumption that coercive pressure can dismantle entrenched armed movements is being tested. So far, it is failing. And I think that is rather instructive, actually. It shows that military superiority alone does not produce strategic outcomes when the targeted society has already integrated resistance into its identity and survival practices. Therefore, this brings all of the analysis we've gone over to one central strategic contradiction here. Israel's security doctrine is built around deterrence through force, demonstrating military capability to impose costs on adversaries. But deterrence through force depends on the adversary valuing what is threatened more than what is defended. In Lebanon, this calculation does not hold. The social structures sustaining resistance do not rely on state-led reconstruction or foreign capital flows or external guarantees. They rely on local networks, community institutions, and political identity shaped by historical experience. And when force is applied, it doesn't eliminate those structures, it reinforces them. So Israel can escalate. It has the means, and goodness knows the US will keep supplying more of that. But escalation does not guarantee strategic victory. A ground operation in the south of Lebanon would carry significant risk of extended conflict with unclear endpoints, which is what led to the current ceasefire to begin with. It would invite regional intervention. It would strain diplomatic alliances. It would deepen the documentation of harm. The gains would be uncertain. Certainly Israel is seen to have lost previously here, and further losses would no doubt be immediate. On the other hand, de-escalation would require acknowledging that Lebanon's internal security arrangements reflect sovereign choice, not foreign imposition. That their national security and sovereignty does matter. It would require treating resistance not as a removable anomaly, but as an embedded reality that isn't for external actors to determine the right to exist or not. It would require negotiation rather than conditionality, and given what is happening and has happened throughout this ceasefire, good luck with that one. Why should Lebanon trust those of you threatening it now, promising respect and being seen as equals later? And so the situation continues. Airstrikes on infrastructure that keeps communities functioning, diplomatic statements linking relief to disarmament, internal political unity as a defensive response, legal scrutiny building, regional actors watching, elections approaching under pressure. And the assumption that Lebanon will bend remains in place, despite the evidence showing it won't. The campaign is not weakening the resistance, it's legitimising it. The strikes are not fracturing Lebanese society, they're reinforcing the view that sovereignty must be defended. The diplomatic threats are not forcing compliance, they are demonstrating the extent of external interference. The strategy is producing the opposite of its intended effect. There's no stable path forward under this approach. Continued pressure increases cohesion, legal exposure, and reputational damage in the country. Escalation risks regional conflict. De-escalation requires acknowledging the failure of coercion. So the question is not whether these conditions are going to change. They're not likely to, are they? The question is whether those applying the pressure will recognise that the outcome they seek is already lost. This is where the situation stands now, as I see it. The campaign is underway. The documentation is building. The resistance will continue to endure. The society will keep on absorbing the impact. The state will hold its position, maybe. And the policy that aimed to break Lebanon is once again confirming why Lebanon learned to resist in the first place. Of course, it's not only from a position of coercion and the threat of war where Israel is falling on its face with regards to Lebanon either. It's happening from a legal standpoint too. So get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. It really isn't a front they're winning any favours on. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. And I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.